can you tell us a bit about the differences between the US and the UK on this? Because obviously you spend most of your time
Yeah.
arguing for this kind of change in the US. There's a very different context because you've got you've got a lot of space to build solar power. You've got a lot of space to build wind. Like it's a very different type of market, and energy costs are much lower in the US. How much is what is the experience that you've been through in the States transferable to what we're going to need to do here?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, we've got both space issues in the U.S., which look very different than in the United Kingdom, and also resource issues. The oil, gas, and coal industries in the United States are enormous and also have a lot of political power, particularly within the Republican Party. And so you've also got a lot of pressure against the clean energy transition in the U.S. that you don't have in the United Kingdom. Also, particularly 2 or 3 years ago, we had an enormous amount of capital that we could leverage in the United States that almost no other country around the world, except for China and some of the countries in the Middle East, could bring to bear. So there are enormous differences there. The similarities, particularly in terms of lessons learned, can be in delivery. The United States went from not really having any of a industrial strategy or significant government role in energy planning and clean energy scale for decades. And we went from basically 0 to 60 miles an hour in the course of 2 years. There are a lot of lessons on how does government need to be structured differently? What were unintended or unintended consequences that came up? What are the obstacles that could be overcome? And mechanisms that the United Kingdom and other countries could learn from. And I think that in particular, those are places where labor has been and could look at the U.S. and say, oh, okay, if we're going to have the government play a big role, for example, in thinking through where and how energy should be built, what are the government institutions that can do this? How do we avoid too many agencies all wanting to have a place in it without coordination, without someone being able to ultimately make the decision?
Mm.
Can I come in here just to add something which I think is quite important? I think Josh is completely right on all of those differences. I think one thing I wanted to add to that, rather than to disagree with any of that, is to talk about the differences in how in the US versus in the UK, and actually not just the UK, but Europe more generally, how there have been significant differences both historically and today in the government approach to supporting renewables investment, in the type of support and subsidy mechanisms they provide. So, and just to preface that, the thing I think is really important for people to understand is that there are two related kind of profitability characteristics of the renewables generation sector that potentially inhibit investment. So the first of those is the volatility of profitability. Pricing in the electricity markets, where electricity typically is sold these days, is very, very volatile, probably more volatile than for any other commodity you can think of. And what that means is it's very, very hard for renewables developers to get the finance to proceed with new projects unless there is a mechanism that will stabilize prices over the long term. So stability and volatility is one issue. The other one is the level of profitability. So profits, all other things being equal, tend to be quite low in renewables generation. So now to think about the support mechanisms, the UK, the main support mechanism that historically has been used in the UK, lots of listeners will have heard of this, is the so-called feed-in tariff. It's called something different now. It's called contracts for difference. It essentially does the same thing. But it is very, very clever in the sense that it solves both the volatility problem and the level of profitability problem. So it stabilizes and subsidizes where subsidy is necessary. The US is very, very different from that. So again, as many listeners will know, particularly having read about the Inflation Reduction Act, is that in the US, the main mechanism that has been used historically is tax credits, either investment or production tax credits. And they provide subsidy, but what they don't provide is stability. So actually in the US context, you have developers face this in a way, an almost greater problem in getting financing, because they can get subsidy from the government, but they can't get stability. So they have to find that price stability through other mechanisms, of which things like corporate power purchase agreements, again, lots of listeners will have read about how Amazon and Google and the likes help fund new renewables projects, because they will say, look, if you develop this new wind farm, we will buy your electricity at a fixed price for the next 12 years. And so in the US, it's an even greater challenge than it tends to be in the UK. So very, very different government mechanisms, but with the same kind of outcomes very much in mind.